For this video, I'm going to go through each of the core set rares in the color yellow for Mythgard, and I'm going to talk about which ones I would recommend crafting for a new player, and which ones I think you should expect to see potentially on the ladder, or what decks you might consider playing some of these cards in if they see play at all. And we're not going to spend too much more time on the intro, we're going to dive right in. We're going to start with Clay Effigy. This one is a bit tricky for me to evaluate, so of course naturally this is the one I start with. On the one hand, I don't think I've ever built a yellow deck that does not run Clay Effigy. This is definitely a staple because it's very cheap, it's a nice cycle card, and the 0-1 is great for just kind of stalling, right? You can just put a body in front of something and not take some damage, and that's beautiful. However, I don't know if I would recommend crafting this for a new player because while this definitely does see play, it's not the sort of card that makes a huge impact in your deck. You're not going to suddenly win a ton more games because you top deck Clay Effigy, if that makes sense. So you want this card, you're going to be excited if you get it, and if you go through some of your other must craft rares first and then you're looking for something to craft, this is definitely next up. This is a yellow staple, but it's not what I would consider to be at the very top of my yellow must crafts. Next up is Godspore Mushroom. This card does see occasional play in certain aggressive and mid-range lists. For example, there are a couple of Valkyrie lists that choose to include this in a blue-yellow version of the deck. I don't, however, think that this is a must-craft by any means, and even the decks that do run it, I'm going to be honest, I prefer non-Godspore Mushroom decks. I think that the randomness can certainly high roll and win you some games, but I think that it's a bit too unreliable, and as such, just my own personal opinion is that I don't think your deck gets better for including this card, but even more so, it's just not seeing a lot of play in many decks, one or two, and that's about it, so I wouldn't recommend crafting it. You know, obviously, remember the card exists, you will run into it from time to time on the ladder, but it's not something I would recommend for new players. Next up, we have Helm of Conscription, and this is a card that does see play in swarm decks, but it's not so like general purpose must craft in my opinion. In fact, there's another artifact we're going to get to later that I think is much higher on the crafting priority list. But that being said, this is certainly a card that does see play. It does also see play in a artifact list. There is a yellow-green kind of control Fires of Creation list that jams a large number of artifacts in its deck for a number of reasons, and it certainly sees play there. So this is a good card. You should expect to run into this, but I would not consider this to be an early craft choice if I was a new player. Next up, we have Gem Cutter Spider. This is also not something that I would recommend crafting if you're a new player because it's just not very good. I'm just going to be blunt. It's created with 2 strength and health for every unique color of gem on your mana bar. So, in theory, right, you could pay 3 and get like a 6/6 or an 8/8, or, you know, the sky's the limit. And by sky's the limit, I mean 12/12 because we have the 6 colors. But the reality, or like in practice, this is very often a 4/4 for 3, which sometimes is just powerful enough. If you go with 2 yellow gems and another gem, and you're playing this on curve at 3, you know, a 4/4 for 3 is not bad. Certainly that gets played in orange, for example, but it doesn't do anything else. It's just a 4/4 for 3, and if you're really looking for upside, you're probably playing this in a 3-color deck. Those are likely going to be very expensive for you to craft, and so what I'm trying to get at here is that as a new player, I don't recommend crafting this because it takes way too much to get the benefit, and you, if I'm being honest, can get similar benefits from other cards without spending that beautiful essence on it. Alright, next up we have Incubation Chamber. This card sometimes gets played for some meme value, but that's about it. So it was also kind of just recently clarified, if you will. I'm not going to say like adjusted, but the added text that's now on this card of this effect is cancelled if the minion leaves early is relevant because you can no longer play a minion into Incubation Chamber and then use something like you know, Impel, for example, to give it Swift, and then move it out of the Incubation Chamber and then kind of like double down on a single one. So overall, this card's just not very good. It's not seeing a lot of play, and it's not something that I would recommend crafting. Next up, we have Splicing Lab. Even in enchantment-heavy decks, I don't think this is good enough to make the cut. I do not recommend crafting this either. This is essentially the enchantment version of Godspore Mushroom, and it can be fun, but it's not going to be very good. And if you're a new player, I would recommend, you know, trying to shore up the stuff that is good before the stuff that's necessarily fun. Next up, we have Wonder Drug. And, you know, I'm going to back up real quick. We're getting a little bit further. I'm going to throw some context at you right now. Yellow gets included in a couple of mid-range lists, and I think one aggressive list. But for the most part, yellow is very, very much a color based on control or late-game builds. So we're going to be running into some cards here that I'm going to say are must-craft yellow cards if you're planning on playing yellow, but it's going to be with that context of most of these cards are designed for late-game usage. So, going back to what I was about to cover, Wonder Drug. If you're playing yellow control or a late-game yellow deck, this one is up there as far as must-craft goes. It is very, very useful. 4 life and drawing a card for 3 is great. It cycles, it keeps you alive. The added effect of if you have 7 or less life, sometimes that is game winning. If you are at like 6 or 7 health and then you spend 3 and you draw 2 cards and gain 8 health, it can be back-breaking against certain decks. So this card is very good. If you're playing yellow, in all honesty, you're probably playing some sort of late game oriented deck, and Wonder Drug will fit beautifully. Goliaths Web. This card is fun, and I use it in a couple of decks, but it's not what I would consider to be a must-craft yellow deck. It's going to go in specifically enchantment-heavy decks and or just like weird Tangle Skein Spider Tribal decks, if that makes sense. Outside of that, doesn't see a ton of play, and it's not something that I would say is like a must-craft yellow deck. So, must-craft yellow card for a yellow deck. So in that regard, for a new player, I'm going to say, you know, remember it exists. You will run into it from time to time. You can expect to see it on the ladder, but it's not must-craft. Olama Ring. This is likely a must-craft if you are playing Fires of Creation, yellow control. This is likely a must-craft if you're playing Serpent's Den, yellow control. Being able to power up your Serpents is very, very important. And if you're playing Yellow Swarm, it's a must-craft. So this is pretty close. Again, you're not going to throw this in every yellow deck you make, but it gets played in an awful lot of yellow decks, so it's high on the craft list. Magpie Er Sniper. This card is cool. It's fun. It's got a pretty unique like ability set. It certainly, in my opinion, makes it feel like a sniper should in a game like this, but it's kind of a filler card a lot of the time. As your collection gets bigger, it's not going to end up making the cut. So if you're a new player and you own these, feel free to throw them in certain decks. You can get some value out of them, but long term, it's not going to make the cut, so I don't recommend crafting them. Misanthropia. This is probably yellow's like must craft like marquee rare. This is to yellow what Thunderclap is to blue. And again, that's through the lens of most yellow decks are going to be late game oriented decks. I think that I'm just going to be honest. I think that Misanthropia might be the best board clear in the game. Arguably something like Gigantomachia, Armageddon Angel, they're also up there, but they're being mythics. They're less likely to be as relevant, and then even something like Armageddon Angel doesn't clear warded threats. Like Misanthropia is one of the few cards that just pretty consistently clears the things you want it to clear. It gets rid of just about everything, right? Because Blight is a minus effect, so it gets through warded, it gets through all of those really annoying things you don't want to deal with, like armor. So it's basically, in my opinion, the best board clearing card in the game, and it's like your marquee yellow card. Again, if you're playing yellow, it's probably going to be a late game oriented deck, having something like this in your tool set is important, and I think it's the marquee yellow rare. So in case you're wondering, I'm a big fan. Next up is Revelation of Zim Ik. This is good enough to see play. It certainly sees play in a couple of decks. I don't think it's a must craft though. You can get away with not running Revelation. For example, as far as card draw goes, I would highly recommend Wonder Drug over Revelation, because while this draws 3 and this is only 1, you get a lot more utility out of Wonder Drug, and the cheaper cost is very relevant. You have to be in a position to basically spend 5 mana to do nothing to really be running this, and while yellow control can certainly set up those board states, it's not as often, and depending on the colors you're combining with yellow, you might just have better card draw options. For example, if you're playing yellow-blue, I would almost always run Brainstorm over this, because again, the cost differential is very, very relevant. So this is usable, it's powerful, you will run into it on the ladder, but I don't think it's a must craft early on for new players. Again, so far I think your marquee stuff is Misanthropia, Wonder Drug, and then Alama Ring fits in a lot of decks. Effigy is a staple, but not necessarily the one I would craft first. And then we're going to move on. Godsbane Transport. This card is very powerful. It's a great finisher. It creates a lot of board presence on a single body. It is a late game house, so you can certainly play this in decks, but I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a must craft. So after you've crafted some of those other cards that I've mentioned that I think are far more important, I think you could consider crafting this if you really like the yellow playstyle. But even still, this isn't the yellow 6-cost card I would craft first. Spoiler alert. Harvester. Harvester is also a staple in my opinion. As far as like late game yellow control cards, this is the second most important card after Misanthropia. A 6/6 for 6 is great. It can get in and finish a game for you. It can get in and just body block a lot of damage. And it has a very relevant Awaken and a very relevant Demise. So gain 3 health is good. Drawing a card is good. Harvester sees a lot of play on the ladder. If you're playing against yellow, you have to assume they're running them. It's very, very good. And then next up, we've basically got some dual color cards. But as I said in the blue video, we're only going to review the ones that are technically yellow. In this case, Descendant Drone. We'll save Plague Maidens for when we get to green. So Descendant Drone. This is actually a card I played a lot in the alpha. I used to play a red-yellow control stretcher deck, and I can say from experience this card is annoying as all get up, and if you get multiples on the board you can kind of create some weird standstill moments. But it's a very specific deck. It's not the sort of thing I would recommend new players craft by any means. This is more of a, like, you know, I'm building a very specific red-yellow control deck, and then if you don't own these and you're building that deck, then craft them, obviously, because you want to play that deck, but it's not what I would recommend new players craft by any means. And that's it for yellow. So if you made it this far, thank you for listening to me ramble. I know that this one was a bit more rambly than usual, but I'm fighting a headache, so it's been a bit hard to focus. That being said, as a quick recap, I think Misanthropia is your marquee, your highlight yellow rare, because it's just very powerful and it's basically used in everything that is remotely late game and yellow. It's just that good. And then after that, Harvester is incredibly good, Wonder Drug is good, and then your runners up to round out the top 5 would be like Olama Ring and Clay Effigy in my mind. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I didn't scare you away with all my nonsense and you'll stick around for future videos.